What does it mean to make a difference? I thought I was going to make a difference when I joined the Union military. Dozens of star systems, hundreds of colonies, billions of people who relied on the United Armed Forces to defend them. I signed my life away to the recruiter, and I headed straight for the pilot training academy because fighter pilots were the best of the best. Only a few ever made it, but they got the hardest missions, the most important ones. I wanted to be one of the few who made a difference. 3 years and thousands of hours of flight time, with just the hood of my cockpit between me and the void. It took me a while to start thinking in 3 dimensions, to get used to an environment where momentum mattered more than acceleration, and you had to have a 360-degree view, because you could never ever hear your enemy coming. I adjusted eventually. A lot didn't. You grow up with things like air and gravity. It's easy to forget they don't matter out there, in the black. And some people just couldn't handle the nothingness. A single-person fighter can be like a sensory deprivation pod sometimes. They only sent the recruits with the most potential to the academy, and maybe 10% of those made it as far as the written exams. In the infantry, they pride themselves on their physical fitness. Their recruits are made to work out until their muscles burn and to run until they throw up. Our exams were the mental equivalent of that. We'd been preparing for them for years, and still only half the cadets who sat them passed. I made it. I got through the pilot school and the combat training and the endless studying, tutoring, and exams. I was one of the success stories. I was one of the few. I thought that meant I was one of the best. Better than the cadets who hadn't made it, certainly, and all the graduates from the less rigorous officer schools. Better than regular people? You know, I don't even remember thinking about them at that point. I joined up to defend the citizens of the Union, but by the time I finished training, my whole universe was the United Armed Forces. That was the point of military training, after all. They made a brand new squadron for us. Things had been quiet in the few years before I graduated. A few frontier skirmishes, but the attrition rate for fighter pilots was at its lowest in decades. We were more likely to get killed in a bar fight. So, although a handful of my graduating class were sent off to fill gaps in the rest of the fleet, they decided to keep the rest of us together. They decided to give us the shiniest new ships as well, rather than sticking us with the old Star Spears. The logic for that was that, although we didn't have real combat experience, we also hadn't built up any bad habits that the more veteran pilots might have picked up. So they gave us the Void Sabers, the next generation of fighters, the most advanced craft the Union had ever built. Their designers were eager to show the UAF what they could do, and they wanted to start with a blank slate. No crotchety veterans complaining that their control panel was confusing and their old ships did this or that better. They wanted pilots they could mold to their ships rather than the other way around. And we were moldable as putty. That was the point of military training after all. The 121st Squadron, or Raven Squadron as they called us, on account of the black-on-black markings of the Void Sabers only visible in infrared. 50 of us young lieutenants fresh out of the academy, 5 seasoned captains, and Colonel Karn, legend of the fighter corps. It was the happiest moment of my life standing on the flight deck, with him pinning the wings to my shoulder. Stamp of the Union's approval. I would have branded it into my flesh if they'd asked me. Our shakedown cruise was out in Harmony Reach, out beyond the rim colonies, where there are plenty of small unregistered settlements, and plenty of smuggling between them and the Union. Intoxicants, weapons, outlawed cyber mods. There wasn't much in the way of civilization in Harmony Reach. They needed manufactured goods from the Union, and they'd sell their own mother to get them. Most patrols were a single echelon, 10 lieutenants and a captain, scanning a planet or an asteroid field for illegal traders. We found plenty of them. Most of the time they didn't even try to run, but a few gave us a chance to test out the Void Sabers. A warning shot was usually enough to get them to cease sense. 4 plasma cannons are hard to ignore. But there were some who thought they could outrun us. 1 or 2 actually could. I suppose you don't stay in business as a smuggler if you're not slippery, and some of the ships had modifications that the Union's designers would have loved to take a look at. But most of the time, the chase ended when we shot out their engines. It became a competition to see if we could take out the propulsion without damaging the rest of the ship. Most of the time we managed it. Not always, but mostly. The carrier we were operating from would have preferred it if we didn't fill up their hangar bays with junk. But you can't ask a fighter pilot to do sloppy work just because it would be more convenient for you. It was a point of pride. We didn't even think about all the smugglers who ended up in the brig instead of scattered in bits across empty space. The Navy would have preferred it if we'd saved them the trouble of organizing a trial as well, but we were pilots, not executioners. Or so we thought. The carrier group looped around our area of operations, striking out into Harmony Reach, then arcing back around to resupply in the rim colonies. And while the fleet was restocking, we got shore leave. If you've heard anything about the rim colonies, you've heard they're rough places. Whatever you've heard isn't the half of it. I had a great deal of respect for pioneers, terraforming new worlds and building new societies with nothing but sweat and determination. But it takes a certain sort of person to volunteer for a life like that, and trawling through the bars of the spaceport, I saw a parade of every kind of scumbag the Union had to offer. You only ended up in the rim colonies if you had nowhere else to go. The locals kept clear of us for the most part. Whenever a group of pilots entered a bar, everyone would suddenly be interested in their own drink and nothing else, and a few customers would slip out the back. We thought it was because they took one look at us and knew we could handle ourselves in a fight. That was military training was for, after all. Only if one of the locals was very drunk would they tell us what they thought of us. It wasn't flattering. You'd have thought they'd be more grateful to the people keeping them safe, but no. Still, who cares what a handful of bitter old alcoholics think, right? Through a pilot's visor, we all looked like heroes, and that was what mattered. It was on the, fourth or fifth resupply stop that we ended up in a bar just as the local garrison was changing shifts. A dozen of the spaceport's Union security personnel walked straight up to the counter, and anyone sitting there who wasn't already gone got hauled out of their seat and told to beat it. One of them got sucker punched in the stomach for being too slow, but we were having a good time, so we barely noticed. A few drinks in, and the soldiers were starting fights with anyone who so much as looked at them funny, and soon there was barely anyone else in the bar except us. When I went to get the next round of drinks, I told the barman he should call station security and get them thrown out. He just looked at me like I'd threatened to kill his wife and children, confusion mixed with abject terror. I was too drunk to draw any conclusions from this, but I let it drop. The soldiers broke half the furniture in the joint, then left without paying their tab. We were off the station the next morning. I really think that immediately after, the only thing that any of us took away from that night was a reinforced sense that we were the elite of the Union military, several cuts above the local garrisons who were clearly poorly disciplined amateurs. Anything that didn't impact our overinflated egos, we didn't even notice. The civilians who had to deal with those jerks every day? What did they matter? That was what military training was for, after all. It was a few weeks after that, and we were heading back towards the rim colonies again. This time to Halstead's world, a mostly agricultural colony. There had been reports of smugglers attacking local patrol craft, and we were running patrols constantly as we approached the colony. My echelon was out at the edge of the solar system, scanning the remote asteroids. We were spread out, too far apart to help each other, but we weren't expecting trouble. There was no sign of life out here. We were just covering our bases. Then I picked up something on my radar. A small dot broke away from the asteroid I was approaching. At first I thought it was just a geyser. Some asteroids periodically vent debris as the ice inside them is heated and cooled. Then I saw the IR signature of an engine flare. I ramped up power to the engines, and as the G-forces pushed me back into my seat, I toggled the safeties on my weapons. My comms were open. The rest of my echelon knew where I was, but they wouldn't reach me before I made contact with the unknown ship. It wasn't fast. I caught up to it easily. But I was in a state-of-the-art fighter, and the ship I was chasing was a passenger vessel, 5 decks, less than 200 meters long, the sort of ship that's mostly used as an in-system ferry, but occasionally gets outfitted with a hyperdrive. I fired a warning shot. It accelerated. It was no match for a Void Saber, of course. Its engines were embedded well into the superstructure, a safety feature, sacrificing cooling for protection, except in this case, it made it harder for me to target them without blowing the whole ship up. I gunned my engines and came right up alongside it. There were no weapons visible, and I figured if it had anything hidden away, it would have used them rather than trying to run. I thought I just had to get their attention, make it clear they couldn't escape. So I positioned myself only a few meters off their starboard side. I could see right into the ship. Passenger ships are built for comfort and enjoyment, so there were windows all along the hull. I was expecting to see row after row of empty seats, with whatever they were smuggling packed away in the cargo hold. Instead, I saw that it was full of people, men, women, and children, looking at me, wide-eyed. It was still accelerating, and my sensors showed that it was spooling up its engines to go into hyperspace. My ship was relaying all this data to the carrier and squadron command. The captain of my echelon, Dax McCain, told me to disable the fleeing ship. I replied that I couldn't. There were civilians on board, and I risked destroying the ship if I fired on it. He told me I had to try it anyway. We argued back and forth for a moment. He was sympathetic, but orders were orders. We were there to take down any illegal shipping. 3, maybe 4 times I refused to open fire. Then Colonel Karn himself came on comm. I explained to him that it was a passenger ship, not a smuggler, and it was full of civilians. Didn't matter. Colonel Karn was adamant and completely unsympathetic. We didn't know that it wasn't carrying illegal goods in its cargo hold. Even if it wasn't, it was an unregistered ship carrying unlicensed travelers. They were breaking Union law, and if they wouldn't surrender, then they deserved what they got. He ordered me to open fire, gave me a direct order. I punched the accelerator again and darted out ahead of the passenger ship. It wouldn't be long before it entered hyperspace. I had to get them to stop now. I put myself right in front of them, turned, and fired a warning shot so close to their bridge that it probably scorched the paintwork. They still didn't stop. Colonel Karn came through again, and again he ordered me to take the shot. There was a dangerous growl in his voice. I let the passenger ship pass by me, then positioned myself directly behind its engines. Sublight drives were powering down, ready for the jump to hyperspace. No sound from the engines, no sound from the ship. I couldn't hear the children screaming in fear. You're always alone in space. All I could hear, over and over again, was Colonel Karn roaring at me, "Take the shot! Take the shot! Take the shot!" And I did as I was ordered. That was what military training was for, after all. I lined up my shot as carefully as I ever had, aiming for their hyperdrive only, and I fired. And just as I'd feared it would, the plasma bolt sliced through the ship and hit something vital. The passenger ship came apart in a rippling wave of internal explosions. There wasn't even enough left afterwards to tell us for sure how many had died. But it was definitely hundreds. Hundreds of men, women, and children. I'd finally made a real difference. When we got back to the carrier, Dax told me that Colonel Karn had decided to overlook my borderline insubordination. It was a difficult situation, but I got the job done. I just stared straight through him. So he took me to the mess hall, and he leaned on the cooks until they gave us the home-brewed stuff the officers aren't meant to know about. 3 drinks in? I asked him. Is this how you live with yourself? Better than the alternative, he answered. because the only way to really live with yourself was to become the mindless drone the Union wanted you to be, to believe that whatever you were ordered to do was right, because it was the Union telling you to do it. Compared to that, alcoholism was practically healthy. I'd like to say I turned against the Union right then and there. Decided to get out of the military no matter what it took. But if I was that sort of person, I'd have told Colonel Karn to go to hell and let the passenger ship escape. I still believed in loyalty, sacrifice, duty, and I couldn't quite let go of what they'd told me those words meant. So I did exactly what Dax had warned me against, and decided it wasn't my place to question orders. If my superiors decided something was necessary, then they knew better than me. And yet, I still felt queasy when they pinned a ribbon on my chest at the end of the tour. Our anti-smuggling operations had been a great success, over 100 ships captured or destroyed. They didn't even mention the casualties. We hadn't taken any. So as far as they were concerned, there hadn't been any. They gave us a few months in the core territories before we were moved onto the active roster again. We'd passed our first test with flying colors as far as they were concerned, and justified their decision to give the best ships they had to the greenest pilots. But they still didn't want to risk giving us too much too soon. So we got to spend a few weeks on New Dakota, sunning ourselves on the beaches and wiping out in the surf. Then we got assigned a new carrier and a whole new fleet. Muster point was Earth orbit, and for the first time in years I got to go home. My parents were just happy to see me home safe. My older sisters wanted to show me off to their friends, and my nieces and nephews wanted stories of my heroics. Suddenly, I found it hard to talk to them. Every time I looked at them, I saw the wide-eyed faces staring out of the windows of that passenger ship. We did 2 more anti-smuggling tours. More arrests, more shoot-downs, more things we just had to find ways to ignore. Then a few months back at the academy teaching the newest class all the tricks to piloting the Void Sabers. They were only 2 years younger than us, and it felt like we were babysitting a bunch of kids. After that, we were given shore leave on Brandenburg, then shipped out for the Rim colonies again. This time, on the other side of the Union, instead of Harmony Reach, we'd be operating in the Magellan cluster. This was a rougher patch of space in both senses of the term. Nebulae and gravitational distortions made it difficult and dangerous for ships to operate there. Naval cruisers had a tough time out there, so more of the patrol work was done by fighters. And because it was a difficult place for the Navy to operate in, it attracted what the briefings called the criminal element. Not just illegal mining and smuggling trying to stay out of sight, but pirates who would actively attack Union shipping. Pirate activity had been increasing in recent years, and losses had started to mount. The Union was deploying more naval assets to the area to clamp down on the border regions before they got completely out of control. We were the best of the best, so we were being sent out there to hunt down as many piratees as we could find. We were going to make a difference. They said those exact words in the briefing, and I felt nauseous for a moment until I pushed it down again.